seen two children fighting, and then, someone comes and breaks it up and then says, hey, you guys can't fight, that's not cool. We all know what each kid says. They both say, but he started it, right? What I maintain is that he started it, or they started it, if you want to be neutral about it, that is the most important ethical truth that we have as humans. He started it, that whoever initiates force or fraud or violence, that they're in the wrong, and that you have a right to defend yourself through retaliation. Now, what the adult says in this situation is, it doesn't matter who started it. I'm going to end it. Which is cute, and a lot of dumb people think it's clever, but this is actually the greatest lie in ethics. A horrible untruth that people need to stop saying, particularly to children. Because what that adult is saying is, fuck you, ethics doesn't matter, justice doesn't matter, fairness doesn't matter, what matters is power, and I'm bigger than you, and I'm going to attack you. The political spectrum is the spectrum of violent solutions to social problems. So from the right all the way to the left, all of the solutions that are within that spectrum, that you advocate a solution, and then that solution corresponds to a position on the political spectrum, 100% of those positions are in violation of the non-aggression principle. Every single one of them involves the initiation of violent force upon others in the form of a government, which is a group that claims a legal monopoly on the right to initiate force against others. Now, if you stub your toe and then you go and put a Band-Aid on it, I would argue that you can conceive of this solution as being not on the political spectrum, but to the right of it. Now, I would say 100% of all peaceful solutions to problems, from the tiniest ones all the way to the biggest problems that you can conceive of, all of the solutions to those problems that do not involve the government belong to the right of that political spectrum and are anarchist solutions. So this means that, over 99% of all of the solutions that you use in your daily life and in your relationships with others are actually anarchist solutions. You can't say that all solutions have to be done through the government, right? So the question is, where do we draw that line? I would draw the line at saying as many solutions as we possibly can that do not involve the initiation of force, that we should get as many of those solutions off of the political spectrum as possible, as quickly as possible, and that, generally speaking, when we switch out state solutions for non-state solutions, things seem to work better. And it seems that today we're in a situation where a lot of services that formerly were offered by the private sector, now people don't even think that's possible, even though it was historically the case. Private roads have been a thing. Fraternal or friendly societies have been a thing. And dispute resolution organizations, I think, set up a pretty convincing model for how disputes could be resolved without a state. If you explained to a bunch of American slavers how we're going to pick the cotton once we get rid of slaves, they would rightfully think that you're fucking crazy. If you told them that giant robots would go through the fields and thresh it all up and do all the fucking work for you, they would think you're fucking insane. Likewise, if you went even further in the past and then explained to people, hey, we're going to have this thing called democracy where the people will self-govern, they would think you're off your goddamn rocker. They would think that that is pie in the sky, idealistic fucking horse shit, right? So this argument, this dismissal from, oh, it's an appeal to utopianism, it's completely irrational, and we already hold beliefs that are extreme and basically beliefs that, if we were to share these beliefs with people in the past, we'd be labeled a lunatic fucking extremist. Turns out humans try things and learn things and get better over time. And I do believe that in the future, humans are going to look back at people in this time period who believed that government was necessary, and they're going to laugh at you. They're going to make fun of you. They're going to think that you were absolutely, completely fucking ridiculous for thinking that government, something as just bureaucratic and inefficient and just fundamentally immoral as government, was necessary. They're going to laugh at you and they're going to make fun of you. Statists always beg the question. They don't provide a valid moral justification for having a state in the first place. So the reason that we have a social contract is precisely because people who are advocates of it recognize that you can't have a real contract that way. The reason we have tacit consent is because proponents of it understand that it's not consensual. These are sophistic redefinitions of the words, basically to set up an equivocation fallacy. And you see this whenever anybody makes the quote unquote love it or leave it argument, right? It's the same argument, anyone with a frontal lobe understands that this argument would not apply if you were born into a cell phone contract. That they can't say, well, you were born into it and didn't, kick and stream hard enough as a pre-born potential human. You didn't, speak up at that time when we all decided this shit. That's essentially the moral character of people who advocate for government. And that's why their argument is basically, oh, well, there'll be absolute chaos without it. And really, I don't think that people who make this argument have given it any serious thought. Look at it this way. You have grounds for being agnostic on this issue. Just as people like to be agnostic on the question of whether or not a God exists, they'll say, you know what, I take a neutral position. Now, I would say such a person technically is an atheist. They're an atheist in the sense that babies and tables are atheists, which is the sense that they do not hold or do not possess that positive belief regarding God. Now, what I would say is that a person who believes in government and believes in the state and believes that it's necessary, whatever that means, and that's a serious question. What does that actually mean? What does necessary mean? For anybody who holds that position, what you are saying is that as a matter of certainty, that all of the solutions for which you advocate a government solution, that it is impossible, that it is 100% inconceivable, 100% logically impossible, it will never occur, it is a square circle. That is the standard that you're claiming. Here's what I'm looking for. Is there a case, are there good examples of people invoking an ethical theory that doesn't fit squarely into libertarian ethics regarding the NAP, the non-aggression principle? What I mean is that whether it's communism or any form of justifying government, any kind of conflict, pretty much anything outside of full-blown psychopathy, the aggressor always makes up some bullshit justification for why their victim actually initiated force against them. Or they use the most dangerous perpetrator of all, which is structural violence, at which point you are then entitled to reacting, to revolting against everyone, because there's no perpetrator. That the perpetrator is the profit motive. The perpetrator is society. The perpetrator is a thunderstorm. The perpetrator is the fact that I have to eat in order to continue living. That's not fair because I didn't choose it. That expands the definition of violence, particularly of initiation of force, to such an extreme level that retaliation against anything becomes morally justified. This is how leftist entitlement thinking works, is that, well, if only things were set up in my choice way, with my choice ideal government, we'd have a fucking utopia by now. Therefore, utopia minus whatever I have now, that's how much I'm entitled to taking. And because it was society, who I perceive as having dropped the ball, I get to just take it from anyone in society, particularly anyone in society who's better off than me, regardless of how that happened. If you're actually a genuinely skeptical person, or actually a person who, takes this question seriously and thinks about it, I think that there should be a lot more people in that neutral space. There should be a lot more people saying, I don't know. That's a hard question. Because frankly, I'd rather try to prove that God exists than try to prove that governments are justified. Frankly, I think that the argument for trying to say that God exists is an easier argument to make, even though I don't think it's valid. It's an easier thing to try to argue than that the government is justified or even good, or even that we need it to any degree or in any situation at all. Look at any war, look at any conflict. They always say this person started it. They shouldn't have done this. Look at police instances, right? They say, well, they were resisting, and maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. And my point is that, the moral reality in every single situation it is a matter of fact. It's a matter of objective fact. Who is the initiator? And I think that we can boil down a lot of ethics to simply finding the best objective answer to these questions. Who initiated force or fraud first? What was the damage? How much did they owe in restitution or compensation? I think that this answer is sitting here hiding in plain sight, and that we have this glorious opportunity to start to model society around a basic ethical principle that everybody already agrees to. Because the most powerful weapon in the libertarian arsenal when it comes to speaking about ethics is the fact that libertarians can get anyone, virtually anyone, to agree to the basic principles of libertarianism, because libertarianism is like a lowest common denominator of ethics that every single ethical theory seems to be using. So, I'd like to invite people to throw out some great counterexamples to this, because I think that there's a lot of probably interesting insight in such counterexamples. But I would say that virtually across the board, I really invite you to try this out. Anytime you see an issue, an ethical issue, a moral issue, a conflict between humans, any of these conflicts, look for people repackaging the event to say that somebody else was the initiator. That seems to always be the point. And if that is what we're always doing, why are we pretending that we're not libertarian? Why are we pretending that we're not trying to function on and apply libertarian ethics? What else could you conclude? Basically, once you boil down the political spectrum to the non-aggression principle, and then say that a government has a larger monopoly in the sense that it has more services that it claims the exclusive right to dealing with, what you're left with is all of the so-called right-wing authoritarian governments. Under this understanding of the political spectrum, those are all left-wing governments. And it makes more sense to go by that standard, where on the political spectrum there's a single variable, which is the overall size and scope of government. I understand size and scope could be two variables, but they're kind of the same thing, right? The idea is you increase scope or you increase the degree to which you're policing people under a scope that you already have, some combination of growing both of those. Either way, it puts you further to the left under the principle that you're making the government bigger, right? Well, if you accept right-wing authoritarianism as a thing, if you're one of those people who thinks that it's useful to place Nazis on the right wing of the political spectrum, what you've just done is made it so that whether you go left or the right has absolutely no bearing on how big the government is, or on how tyrannical the government is, or on what its scope is. In other words, you've created, a spectrum where you're measuring buildings, where you put the very tall buildings on the left side and the very wide buildings on the right. And it doesn't make any fucking sense compared to making a spectrum where you have very tall buildings and very short buildings on an end. So, insofar as the way that I use the political spectrum reduces things, and it's very simplistic, at least it makes sense. When people talk about, right-wing authoritarianism, I think that it's absolute nonsense. A government can only be evil to the degree to which it's left-wing, because the degree to which it's left-wing determines how big the government is. Government is essentially morally wrong and evil, so more government is more evil. So you can take that two-dimensional, the two-dimensional political compass. The lower left corner does not exist and the upper right corner does not exist. You can just cut those corners off and then flip it on its side, and now we have a regular spectrum again. And then scribble out left and right evil, and then scribble out right and right good. Or more accurately, more evil, less evil. And then once we finally get to the absolute rightmost edge of that political spectrum and then jump off of it, that's where we finally have solutions that are potentially not evil.